Alright, we have our Colossus 205 transfer case here. This is the older model. We replaced it with the new version, which in this video we go through the build process of putting it together. The other one is currently in the car. This is the older one, and we'll go over some of the upgrades that they did and the basic knowledge of the transfer case. One of the cool upgrades that they did was they got rid of the steel shifting arms here. These ones tend to bend, and they were kind of a pain in the butt to work with. And they went to more of a billet setup. Super bulletproof. I like them a lot. Super thick, and we haven't had any issues with it. We were currently raced King of the Hammers 2022 with it, and we didn't have we had zero issues with it. So another upgrade is they went through and they basically beefed up all their shifting forks and everything with a more billet design. All the shifting mechanisms and everything, they beefed up just about every part of this transfer case they could. They also got rid of the pry points. In the video I go through these pry points and I talk about them a little bit. They got rid of them, they shaved them off, and they used a jack bolt for the front of their case to separate the two halves. Super cool. I like that a lot. I was able to take it apart with very little effort. Their detents are a little stronger. It makes it more noticeable when you do shift into a high-low range or front dig or rear-wheel drive or any shifting on the transfer case, especially when you have a 12-to-1 shifter like I have. It makes it very noticeable, which is great, so you don't overshift and start destroying things. And putting it together, we'll go over on how to do a driver's side drop, passenger side drop. Basically, you just separate this half here, the front of the case, and you take it and you flip it completely over, and that basically gives you a driver's side drop or a passenger side drop, and that's it. That is how you do it. Super simple. I suggest getting one of these cool drain plugs. It is a magnet drain plug. It's really neat. It works out really well. I have saved myself a lot of grief with having one of these bushings from the shifting forks. Actually, the bolt came out on the old design, and that magnet picked it up before it destroyed everything. And I'm actually currently running the original gears that I got with this transfer case five years ago, I believe. I've been with Behemoth, a sponsored driver of theirs, for quite some time, and I love their products. They do an absolute amazing job on all their stuff. They take a lot of pride in their work. This front half of the case, so you can see that it has all its clocking positions, and you can clock this thing in any direction you want, which is awesome, because we have a new car build that we'll be putting this, not this model transfer case, this one's going to get retired, and we're going to have the newer version of the Colossus 205. But we have it clocked totally, completely flat. You know, the way it lines up is completely flat. You can do whatever you want with it. It's really nice. It's not down a little bit or up just a little bit. So they did a really good job on putting that together. And so in the video, we're going to go over and put the gears together and how I do it and how it's worked for me for the last few years. Um, and we have been running this thing with a tremendous amount of horsepower going through it for our Ultra 4 car. And we're running a big block behind it, so we have a ridiculous amount of low-end torque, and we haven't had any issues with this transfer case whatsoever. So it's pretty awesome. Totally stoked about it. And, I'm happy to run their products. We'll keep running them. We'll try to break them every time. So, all right, guys. Well, let's get started on this video, and we'll slap this thing together. I'll have a couple side-by-sides with the old case and the new case here in a minute, and we'll see the differences.
All right, we're going to go ahead and open this case up. We're going to pull all these 3/8 bolts out that hold the two halves together. And then we're going to demonstrate the jack bolt that Behemoth did. Super awesome upgrade from the old pry points they had on there. And those pry points were great, but sometimes they'd get in the way for mounting these cases in other applications, and they worked, but you ended up tearing the case up. And we'll place one of the bolts in the bolt hole, jack bolt hole on one side and the other, and we just zip it down, and you can see it opens that case. Splits them in half with very little effort. You'll see that the case has one solid O-ring on it, which is a great upgrade from the old one. The old one had a split O-ring, and it tended to leak a little bit. Now, in this case, you can flip it from driver's side drop to passenger side drop. All you do is you take that back half and you simply just flip it over. That's it. And here you'll see that the shifting forks from the older model are just beefed up. The machine work that they did on this case is just through the roof. They did such an amazing job putting this thing together. The shifting mechanism, everything, they just well thought out process on this one. And they have the shifting fork bushings are the same as the old style, but they added a set screw into them. And the older case seemed to, they just rattle loose. So adding that set screw really helped out. And we'll go ahead and start loading this thing up. Now we're going to go ahead and start by pressing our center shaft in the one half of the case, and we're basically just going to press it down to where all the slop is gone, and there's a little resistance in the gear there, the bearings. And I've been doing it this way since we've started using this case, and I have yet to have a problem. It seems to be working for me. You'll see we got a little resistance there. And we'll put that back half together with the loaded gears, and we'll make sure you put it in the proper orientation. Our drop is a passenger side drop, and we'll put it on there. We'll zip our little 3/8 bolts back in, and we'll get it all together. And when I put these bolts in, I'll kind of do like a little star pattern just to help prevent the case from flexing around too much and potentially stripping a bolt or cracking or breaking something. Helps press that center shaft in the other side nice and straight as well. we go. And you'll see we got the Behemoth Drivetrain and the Riley Racing logo on one side. Super awesome. I love being partnered up with these guys. Now we'll put our preload washer and nut on there, and we'll tighten that up a little later. Make sure we get our cover on there for our center shaft. Now the cool thing about this transfer case is you can go to the parts store and buy just about everything you need for this thing from your local parts store. It is a 205. The only thing that's aftermarket is the case. And you can go get the gaskets and utilize the paper gaskets. I like using the silicone to seal everything up. Here you're going to see we're going to put our input shaft in. Now the way I do this is I take the upper shifting fork bushing out, that little brass bushing on the top, and I leave the lower one in. And then I'll slide the shaft in there, and then I'll take the shifting collar and I'll install it with the bottom in first on the bushing, and then I'll install the bushing on the upper half. I'll just slide it around. I'll show you here in a minute. But before I do that, I'll put the outer bearing on. And that just helps hold everything together nice and straight. So when we put it together, that little bushing or the other half of the input together, it's not bouncing around and giving us a hard time. Just sort of tap it on there. I'll spin it around and show you. And just like that, just holds it nice and straight for us. And we'll get that in there, and then we'll slide our little bushing in, and we'll tighten it down through the top. Now the hole that you're going to be tightening it through is one of the vent holes, and I'll show you that vent that we put on there a little later on in the video towards the end. And it's a super easy process. And we'll go ahead and put our output shaft on. Now there's a ton of little bearings in there. We got to make sure they're all nice and straight. And what I do is I put some nice tacky grease in there to keep them from falling. And in one movement, we'll make sure we have our gears lined up from the center shaft, and then just drop that thing right in. It's make sure it drops in all the way. Then you'll know that you don't have any bearings that fell out. And we'll keep it nice and clean. It's a bummer having to take the case apart because you failed to clean it good enough. And we'll make sure it shifts nice and easy. Now here we're going to put the speed sensor housing and the output shaft housing together all in one piece. Kind of a pain in the butt to do it this way, but it takes a little bit more effort, but it works out really well. And it has the speed sensor ring in there that you got to line up and get it in there. I'll put some silicone on there, and then we'll drop this thing in. We'll make sure we're getting it all lined up nice and straight. Now you'll notice that the that little housing has some cutouts, and it lines up with the center shaft cover. Make sure we got to have that notch in that general area. As you can see, it takes a little bit of effort to get it lined up, but it'll end up going on there. Give it a little tap and slides right on. There we go. And we'll just put a bolt or two in there just to retain it. And we have a pretty cool cover that we make that goes over the top of that. Now here's our front output. We're going to take this little snap ring off here and then separate the gear, and we'll have to put it all back together once it's installed into the transfer case itself. You'll see when I pull this apart, I'll take the gear and the washer off spacer, and that there will be a ton of little needle bearings, and there's going to be 2 stacks of bearings. So you'll have one, and then you'll have a divider washer, and then another stack. I'll show you how to install these in a little bit. We'll get this shaft installed. We'll take that ring off, and we basically do it the same way we did the other shaft. We'll install it with the upper shifting fork bushing removed, but the lower intact, and it just makes it a whole lot easier. There's a whole nother way you can do this by removing the shifting fork completely, sliding it out, and then installing it all. But this way seems to work best for me. That's the way I've been doing it since day one, and it works out great. And we'll take that other bearing, the outer bearing, and we'll tap it in just like we did the other side. Make sure it's nice and clean. That just holds everything together while you're installing the rest of the gears and everything. Yeah, we'll give it a little tap. Now these gears, I have been using these gears for 5 years now, and I have yet to have any wear or tear on any of them. Everything fits in this transfer case perfect. I'll make sure everything moves around nice and neat. And then we'll install that upper shifting fork bushing. We'll basically just drop it into the channel of the shifting ring and rotate it to the upper position with the set screw on the outside facing the ends of the transfer case so we can tighten them down. Not the easiest process, but it's got to get done. I'll slide it up, and you can see it very well through that vent port up at the very top. It is a direct sight right there. We'll line it up a little bit, and then we'll drop our little 1/4 Allen head down there. We'll tighten it up, and then we'll tighten that set screw up after we get the upper bolt nice and snug. And we'll take our gear that we pulled apart. I use a high-tack grease before I install it, and it just makes it a whole lot easier to install those little needle bearings and to keep them from falling, and it just sort of sticks to the gear. You'll see I got the case leaned back, and that just makes it a million times easier. Just let gravity hold them in place. There you go. Drops right in. And we'll start with the bottom. We'll take all those little needle bearings and make sure they're right where they need to be. And we'll do one row of bearings, and then we'll put our divider ring in there. That's just a big washer that slides over the top of those ones, and then we'll stack another set on there. Now there should be enough bearings to go completely around the shaft with no gaps. If there's gaps, you're missing a bearing. Make sure we have them all in there before the transfer case is complete. We'll put our washer on there and then put our snap ring, and that washer retains all those bearings. Put our snap ring on there. And we'll put our cover plate on there. This is the Behemoth cover that we got from our original case 5 years ago, and I love it. It's a great design, and they look cool, and they really look good on that black. We'll make sure we put our gasket on there. Here you'll see I'm just putting a couple of bolts just to retain it, just to hold it in place while I get the rest of the transfer case put together. Here's the other half. We'll put our output, our front output bearing retainer and seal. Make sure you put your gasket on there. And that's also a part sold by Behemoth. They have some really cool stuff. They do a lot of really good machine work. I like all their product lines. I'll just zip them down a little bit, and then I'll crank them all down to torque spec. And I'll put all the torque specs in the description of the video. And we'll put our other bearing retainer on here in just a second for the input. Now the really cool part that they changed was the input shaft retainer. You could see that there's multiple 1/4 holes there, and that's really neat because you could use other transfer case seal and bearing retainers. Oh, we got to make sure we don't forget the snap ring that holds that bearing on that shaft. you'll see that that is a Ford 205 seal and bearing retainer, and they don't like to fit into the Turbo 400 four-wheel drive adapters, so you got to machine them down a little bit to make them fit. Well, you could use, with that modification of those extra 1/4 bolt holes, you can use like an NP241 transfer case seal retainer, and it'll fit right in there perfect. We got a 1 5/16 socket here. We'll crank down our preload nut, and we'll just get it nice and snug because we set our preload earlier with our shop press. Now we're going to put our yoke on there. Now you can install it with the rubber gasket that comes with it. It sits behind the nut. That prevents it from leaking. If you don't want to spend the extra dime on that gasket, you can put some silicone on the splined side of the yoke and zip it down, and that will prevent it from leaking as well. And we'll do this exact same thing for the rear output. And we'll zip it down, we'll crank it down when it's in the car so we can get some extra torque on it. Yeah, we'll crank it down right here. That's our speed sensor. That's where it goes, but we'll end up taking it back out to put the mount bracket that we made. Yeah, here we go. We're going to take these bolts out. That was just basically retaining those while we put everything together. And we're going to put this really cool bracket that we made over here at Rock and Road Performance. And Greg, he built these things, and they're awesome. This transfer case is totally suspended by this mount. Nothing's touching the belly of the car. This thing's totally perfect. It's super strong, and it uses all those bolts to hold it on there. And if you needed one of these mounts, you could call Rock and Road Performance in Loomis and out here in California, and he'd cut you out one, no problems. Yeah, we'll stick our vehicle speed sensor in there. And then we will get our drain plugs, and we will put them in the bottom. There are 2 drain plugs, and they are, I believe, 1/2-inch pipe MPT. And we'll put them in there. You can put some silicone or pipe tape on there if you want. And those other 2 holes are the bolts that retain the shifting rods. So if you had to service it or pull it apart or whatever you had to do, you would pull those out. There's a shifting rod that goes all the way through from the bottom to the top, and that's what retains the shifter fork. You can see I have one barbed fitting on there, and that is the vent tube, and we'll end up putting a second one on the other side. And that's the fill hole. You can fill it from the top, you can fill it from the face right there, and however you want to do it. We'll end up doing that inside the car. Here's the finished product. This transfer case is going in the 4504 and the new 4800 car, Ultra 4. We'll kick some butt with this thing. That's the Behemoth Colossus 205.